So this was the issue of Fate magazine in 1968, 1967, and then Eisenberg himself wrote this book in 1968 called The World of Ted Serios: Thoughtographic Studies of an Extraordinary Mind. And in this book, Eisenberg reports how he began as a skeptic and gradually became convinced that Serios had a genuine psychic gift, although again, the experiments were difficult because Sirius would seem to get better the more he drank. But there is a well-known connection between dissociative states and paranormal powers. So he writes about how between 1964 and 1966, Sirius underwent more than a dozen controlled experiments in front of a constantly changing group of witnesses from the areas of psychiatry, photography, engineering, and other sciences. And he describes his many years of work with Ted and the frustrating complexities of the case, as well as the uncanny quality of the images themselves. And Ted was really, really difficult to work with. He didn't really, he was kind of oblivious to the profound impact with his gifts. So when when Jewel or other scientists asked him how he did it, he would just stare blankly at them, or he would deflect the question, or he would go off into a tale of his youthful bawdy adventures, or talk about beer and women. Sometimes he'd say, "I make love to the camera. That's all there is to it. If I talk nice to the damn thing, like I talk to a woman, the thing will give in." And he found that if there's a room full of scientists prodding and probing, it was a grind. But if they're all relaxed and taking it easy, it's easier for him. He says, "I've got to make love to the camera, see? Treat it like it's a woman. I'm going to get that damn target if it kills me. If I don't get it, the whole thing's kaput. It's a do or die thing. You've got to have an imagination, and that's the truth. If you don't have an imagination, you ain't going to see nothing." He was a Catholic. He asked people to pray for him. He carried a rosary. He went to mass. He was incredibly sexist. He would slap women on the butt and call them broads. Sometimes he would just sit there sheepishly with his eyes downcast. Sometimes he'd lurch to his feet. Sometimes he'd launch into a drunken version of a popular song. One of his favorites was "You Ought to Be in Pictures." Sometimes he'd just get abjectly drunk. And Eisenberg says he just often just wants to take a swing at him and sometimes feels like breaking his neck. And Eisenberg says for a small man, he could be a giant pain in the ass. Jewell was interested in these signs of strain when he was trying for a photograph, what was going through his mind. And it was obviously a long ordeal, sometimes a dreadful ordeal. He pushed and strained, his pulse would race, his eyes would water, his muscles would clench. Sometimes the pressure on his body was enough to make him bleed from the anus. His images were the product of this intense physical and mental concentration, but their content was completely out of control. And sometimes Jewel had to stop the sessions because Ted's pulse was so high. And then Ted started having this nightmare, the same nightmare that he was being pursued by a giant camera. It was as big as a house, and the damn thing is walking towards me, coming at me, and I can't get away. So it started to really put him under a lot of pressure. This is one of the experiments Jewel did. Jewel was interested in why buildings and physical structures were easiest for him to produce. He had a mechanical mind, there's no question about that. He liked making model airplanes and jets and gliders and racing ships and racing cars and battleships out of balsa wood. And he liked thinking about how things were put together and how they fit and how they function. And target images helped him, whether or not he'd seen them in advance. Um, but the Polaroids that emerged depicted not exactly the target buildings, but structures that Ted had imagined or projected or intuited or remembered. And in short, they were actually photographs of things in his mind. So one of the most fascinating aspects of these photographs is the way that they merge the individual inner and the collective outer world exactly in the manner suggested by thought transference and and dreams and the unconscious also. So in the early 17th century, metaphysician Robert Fludd pictured the interior of the brain containing an eye in the same position of the imaginative soul, labeled the oculus imaginationis, this inner eye of the imagination, and it seems to be that's responsible for Sirius's uncanny images, which superimpose a private psychic reality on a world outside the boundaries of the individual ego. Following the clues in the photographs, one is led from the everyday to the bizarre and the ineffable. Matter, space, form, and motion and time are confused in the process, but everyday day residue is still retained. Jewell recognized that Ted's pictures worked according to the principles of unconscious logic. So some of them were composites, juxtaposing images in this odd, shadowy collage, like one was a rhinoceros in front of the Parthenon, which is like something out of Salvador Dali, I think. So this was the target image, Westminster Abbey, and this is what Ted produced. So first of all, it would be possible only from a mid-air perspective. And this is common of his pictures. They would contain parts rather than the whole, or elements that were distorted enough to be barely recognizable, as in dreams. And it's often been pointed out that the unconscious deals with symbolic representations rather than photographic likenesses, which may explain why the images that Serios produced were rarely accurate, but often slipped from the central image to a fringe element. So from the essential to the accidental. This was one of the images that Ted produced when his target was something completely different. Experiments in telepathy have shown that it's precisely what someone does not think of transmitting that's transmitted most clearly. So sometimes images seem to contain leakage from unconscious wishes and expectations. Interestingly enough, not only those of Ted Serios, but sometimes those of the observers who happened to be present in the room at the time.